Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be covering a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms, and subtopic features of organisms. Now, in the previous two videos, we've been discussing about the five kingdoms, and then we learned about the groups within the animal kingdom. So in this video over here, we're going to be discussing about the groups within the plant kingdom, and we're going to take a look at plant classification. Now, when we think about the plant kingdom, there are thousands of species of plants living on our planet, right? Now, if you take a minute to think about all of these species of plants to get an idea about them, you will understand that a common feature shown by all of these plants is the fact that they all have some part of it that is green. So a characteristic green color is shown by all of these plants, and this green color is caused by the pigment called chlorophyll. So that's the feature shown by every single plant. They all have this pigment called chlorophyll, which gives them a characteristic green color. So speaking of chlorophyll, what exactly is chlorophyll? Chlorophyll is basically a pigment, a green colored pigment. And the function of chlorophyll is to absorb light energy, which is needed for the process of photosynthesis. So all plants carry out photosynthesis, and for photosynthesis, light energy, sunlight is required, and chlorophyll performs the function of absorbing this sunlight. All right. So now that we've understood about chlorophyll and the characteristic green color, let's talk about the groups within the plant kingdom. So plant kingdom is a huge kingdom, so it's definitely a good idea to divide it further into smaller groups. So when we talk about the groups within the plant kingdom, an important group of plants are the ferns. So all of us have seen ferns, right? So ferns are basically a simple type of a plant. I'm just going to take a minute and quickly draw up a diagram of a fern. All right, so here's a simple diagram of a fern. You can see, you can understand that it's a very simple type of a plant. It contains leaves and an underground stem and roots of its own. So the leaves of a fern are called fronds. So the leaves of the ferns are called fronds. And one thing you need to understand about ferns is that ferns do not produce flowers. They are non-flowering plants. So if a fern doesn't have flowers, you must understand that it has to have some other form of reproduction to produce new ferns, right? So what structure do ferns have in order to help them with their reproduction? Ferns have these little structures on the underside of their leaves called spores. So on the underside of their leaves, they have these structures called spores, and it is these spores that help in the reproduction of these ferns. So that is the first group of plants that we need to discuss about. And now let's move on to the second important group of plants, the flowering plants. Now, the flowering plants are, again, a huge group of plants. And what exactly are flowering plants? As the name indicates, of course, it means that these are the plants containing flowers. So like I mentioned, it's a huge group of plants. All of these plants have flowers on them, so they are able to reproduce sexually by means of these flowers. So what happens is the flowers are the reproductive structures of the plants, and fertilization happens within the ovary of the flower, and that ultimately produces a seed which can give rise to a new plant. So sexual reproduction takes place within a flower, and since this is such a huge group of plants, we divide this group of flowering plants further into two. So there are two groups of flowering plants, the monocotyledons, or known as monocots in short, and the dicotyledons, which are known as dicots. Now, the moment you hear these two terms, these two groups, monocotyledons and dicotyledons, you must be able to understand that the term mono usually refers to one, having one of something, And the term di usually refers to two, having two of something. So these two groups of flowering plants, the monocotyledons and dicotyledons, are classified as such because monocotyledons are the flowering plants that have only one cotyledon within their seeds. A cotyledon is a seed leaf. So if you look at the structure of their seeds, they have only one cotyledon within it. And the dicotyledons are so called because if you take the structure of their seeds, there are exactly two cotyledons within their seed. So that's how we further classify the flowering plants. We classify them into monocots and dicots. So now let's take a look at the differences between the monocots and the dicots. Now, as the name suggested, the monocots the distinctive difference between the monocots and the dicots is the fact that the monocots have one cotyledon within their seed, whereas the dicots have two cotyledons within their seed. But in addition to this key difference, there are also many other differences between the monocots and the dicots. So let's go through these differences. For example, if you compare the leaf of a monocot versus the leaf of a dicot, there is one important difference, there's one very obvious difference between these two leaves. The monocots happen to have leaves with parallel veins running through it. So the veins within the leaf run parallelly to each other. And we call this parallel venation. Whereas if you take a look at a dicot leaf like this, you will see that the veins within these leaves are net-like. So we call this this type of venation the reticulate venation. So this is the difference if you study the leaves of the monocot and the dicot. And another difference between the two types of plants is the arrangement of their vascular bundles. If you study the vascular bundles of a monocot, you will see that they are complexly arranged, as you can see in this diagram. But if you study the vascular bundles of a dicot, you will see that they are orderly arranged in the form of a ring. So there's an organized arrangement in the dicot vascular bundles. Then let's look at one more difference with regard to the roots of a monocot and a dicot. If you study the roots of a monocot, you will see the roots look something like this, and we call this the fibrous root system, whereas the roots of a dicot have this structure where there is a main root running down, and from this main root, lots of side branches arise. So this system of rooting is called the taproot system. So monocots have the fibrous root system and dicots have the taproot system. And this brings us to the final difference we need to understand between the monocots and the dicots. So let's read through this. The floral parts usually exist in multiples of 3 in monocots, whereas in dicots, the floral parts usually exist in multiples of 4 or 5. So what exactly does this mean? Let's take a look. Now, given here is a monocot flower, and we're going to analyze this monocot flower a bit more closely. So if you study this monocot flower, you can see that it has, this particular flower is having 6 petals on it. So there are 6 floral parts, and 6 is of course a multiple of 3. So all monocot flowers, if you take a look at their floral parts, they exist in multiples of 3. Whereas in contrast to this, if you take a look at a dicot flower, and if you count the number of floral parts in a dicot flower such as this, so let's count the number of flowers in this dicot flower, you can see that there are 5 petals, and 5 is a multiple of 5, of course. So that's how dicot flowers work. They usually have their floral parts in multiples of 5 or 4. So these are the difference between monocots and dicots. And this is actually something that comes up quite frequently in your exams. So make sure that you study these differences between the monocotyledons and the dicotyledons. So that's all you basically need to know. So before we wrap up, let's take a look at a few questions from the question bank. All right, so here's our first question. Which one of the following is a characteristic of a dicotyledon plant? So here are our four answers. They have flowers in multiples of 3. Now this statement is wrong because dicots have flowers in multiples of 4 or 5. They have broad leaves with the presence of reticulate venation, which is correct. We know that dicot leaves show reticulate venation. They have leaves with parallel venation, which is again wrong. And if we look at the fourth answer, it says that dicots possess fibrous root, which is again wrong. So our correct answer is answer 2. So let's move on to our next question, which says both of the species in the diagram below belong to which group? So they've given us the diagram of two plants and they want us to identify which group of plants this belongs to. So let's take a look at the description given here. These plants have leaf-like fronds which have structures containing spores on their lower surface. So we've learned about this group of plants and we definitely know that these two plants, the plants being described are ferns. So that's our answer for that. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope all of you got a good understanding on this topic. So stay tuned to our next video.
Subscribe us now for more videos and content.